You make the case that John Diefenbaker, and you say it quite often in your book, that he was a friend of Indigenous peoples, that he was an advocate, that he fought for Indigenous peoples. And you said that he was a friend of Indigenous peoples like Sir John A. MacDonald, which surprised me when you said that, because I haven't seen MacDonald as being a friend of Indigenous peoples. This was someone who was a key architect of the Indian residential school system, who talked about wanting to do away with the tribal system and assimilate Indian people in all respects. This is someone who, under whose tenure, Indigenous peoples become wards of the Canadian state. This is someone who banned Indigenous cultural ceremonies like the potluck and the Sundance in 1884, legalizes the administrative control of Indians under the British North America Act. So I wasn't sure when you said that he was a friend of Indigenous peoples like Sir John A. MacDonald. I found that curious.
So in the era of Sir John A. MacDonald, Canada was a racist country. The prevailing view of the settlers who came into North America was not one to treat Indigenous people with respect. MacDonald, unlike any other world leader of his era, of his time, and certainly unlike any other politician in Canada or the parties opposite, showed respect and admiration for Indigenous people and saved more Indigenous lives than any Canadian Prime Minister in history.
But Bob, he sought their erasure and elimination. He wanted to get rid of autonomous Indigenous nations. How was that being a friend of Indigenous peoples?
So I think you're wrong on the facts and wrong on history on that. He did not want to do what the Americans did. The Americans declared war on Indigenous people. They slaughtered them. They killed them willfully. They tried to completely eradicate the Indigenous population. And in fact, the American Indigenous population, one of their responses was to come to Canada, where they were treated far more respectfully.
But I didn't say that MacDonald wanted to eliminate Indigenous peoples. What I said was he wanted to erase autonomous Indigenous nations, which is important. There's a distinction there.
So, he was the one, he didn't even want to accept Western Canada as land, and he didn't want to settle that land until treaties were signed with Indigenous peoples. So he signed the treaties that provided for certain, health care and certain rations. Now, not all of his policies were executed faithfully, honestly, or competently. But if you looked for example, when smallpox was devastating population in Canada, the portion of the population that was most protected from smallpox during MacDonald's era were Indigenous people because they got the vaccine when others did not. He gave the Indigenous people the vote against the wishes of the other parties opposite. He didn't go to war with them, and he was sympathetic towards them in all respect. The challenge that he had was he was settling Canada to keep it independent from the United States. That created the need for a national railway and some settlement and some immigration. And so there was a lot of conflict for certain.
But he saw white folks as being superior. When he approved the execution of Louis Riel for high treason and hanged, what was it, I think 8 other First Nations leaders, in 1885 he says, quote, "The executions ought to convince the red man that the white man governs."
When it comes to Louis Riel, who had launched 2 insurrections against the Canadian government that resulted in the murders of Scott and others, MacDonald wanted Riel to be a strong and noble citizen of Canada. Riel fled to the United States. Riel came back to Canada, launched another revolution. MacDonald sent out emissaries to negotiate terms of peace and accommodation with Louis Riel. That was not faithfully executed by his embassies, and violence occurred. It was the legal system, the jury system, that convicted Louis Riel of high treason, for which the crime was death. What MacDonald did at that point was to send out 3 doctors to assess Riel's condition, I think hoping that they would come back and say that Louis Riel was not of sound mind and body, effectively giving him the authority to override what the jury had convicted Riel of, and they came back and said that he was of sound mind and body. I think it was a mistake for MacDonald, for the country, for Riel to have been hanged in that circumstance. It certainly created great divisions in Canada. It was a mistake on his part, but it was not done out of malice. When it comes to the residential schools far, far predated Sir John A. MacDonald and were dramatically expanded after MacDonald. They were never mandatory during MacDonald's terms. And in fact, when there were efforts made to either close residential schools or not to fund them, the complaints at that time came from the Indigenous people themselves. There was an assimilation component to it for certain, but it was done more not to conquer, but in his heart and mind, it was to help, to give them the education, to ensure that they could sustain their lives. It was a terrible thing that happened, but it wasn't done out of malice on MacDonald's part.
I guess we'll have to continue this debate because it's really supposed to be about Diefenbaker, but I'm not sure if it was altruism on MacDonald's part. Like, MacDonald often saw Indigenous peoples as being impediments to the expansion of Canada.
So I think you're mischaracterizing the history with MacDonald. If you go back 15 years ago, the entire country was celebrating MacDonald. Same with Diefenbaker. Indigenous people were celebrating them for what they contributed. And there was one book that came out, Clearing the Plains, that highlighted a quote from MacDonald about not feeding Indigenous people until they were essentially on starvation, which was to encourage them to go to the reserves where the foods were and not to feed them when they were off reserve. And so that took on completely a whole new chapter. But I encourage you to read Patrice Dutil's book on MacDonald and others that have written since then, because it's a very selective interpretation of history that characterizes MacDonald as a villain.
No, I'm not trying to characterize MacDonald as a villain. I actually feel, and you can disagree, that I'm being true to history, that MacDonald absolutely was a nation builder. Without MacDonald, there's no Canada. He was an extraordinary political figure. I've read Richard Gwynn's biography. I read it years ago. He was an impressive political force in this country. So he was a nation builder, but you can also make the argument that he was a nation destroyer in that he destroyed Indigenous nations.
So in that book by Richard Gwynn, a fair assessment is that MacDonald was a progressive, sympathetic leader to Indigenous people when society was profoundly racist. And he was countering the instincts in society to be as respectful as more so than any leader in the world when it comes to dealing with Indigenous populations. So I think you've been quite harsh on MacDonald.
Okay. Well, let's go back to Diefenbaker. You've been listening to a clip of In Bed with the Elephant with me, your host, Adrian Harewood. Be sure to check out the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. And please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast and write a review. We love hearing from you.